Welcome to the Voices for Voices podcast, sponsored by Redwood Living. Thank you for joining us today. I am Justin Allen Hayes, founder and executive director of Voices for Voices, host, and Humanitarian. You can learn more about Voices for Voices on our Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube channel at Voices for Voices, and also on our website at voicesforvoices.org. Voices for Voices is a 501c3 nonprofit charity organization that survives solely on donations. So if you're able to, please consider heading over to voicesforvoices.org to help us continue our mission and the goal and dream to help 3 billion people over the course of my lifetime and beyond. Or you can also send a donation to the mailing address of Voices for Voices at 2388 Beckett Circle, Stowe, Ohio, 44224. Or if you're on the Cash App at Voices for Voices. Are you or somebody you know looking for a volunteer opportunity? If so, you can reach out to us today via email at president@voicesforvoices.org. Now, I founded Voices for Voices to provide a platform for folks to share their stories with others as we work to break the stigma around mental health, accessibility, and disabilities, helping people get the help they need while also helping them prepare or transition into the workforce with the Voices for Voices Career Center, where we connect talent with opportunity for both job seekers and employers alike, from coast to coast and in every industry and job level. And who can forget about merchandise? The Voices for Voices merchandise shop is up and running at voicesforvoices.org/shop, where shipping is always free. And again, all donations are 100% tax deductible. Today's guest joining us in studio is an author, a suicide prevention advocate, and nurse health educator. Please join me in welcoming to the show Gail McPeake. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Justin.
Absolutely. So for our audience, our viewers, our listeners, you may recognize Gail from speaking at our A Brand New Day event last October, talking about her son Tom, suicide prevention, and about some facts that really startled me seeing them, especially since I had a psychiatric hospitalization stay. And a couple of those facts are, after a psychiatric hospitalization, the risk of suicide is 300 times greater during the first week home and 200 times greater than the first month. And so that those set of facts are provided by the Suicide Action Alliance. And that was a few years ago, so I'm sure those numbers have changed. And given the landscape, they may have changed for not the better. So what you'll see right here as we start our conversation with Gail is the book that she wrote. The title is Home Safe: The High Risk of Suicide After Hospitalization for Mental Illness. And it is about her experience, both as a nurse and as a mother of her son Tom, who unfortunately at the age of 38 became one of those statistics that we just talked about. So Gail, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being an advocate for so many and sharing Tom, his voice as the days and months and the years go on.
Thanks, Justin. This is so much important work that you do, and I appreciate this opportunity. So my son Tom was hospitalized in March of 2020, right when the country went into full-blown lockdown for COVID. So I wasn't able to visit him. I couldn't do any type of communication with him other than the shared phone on the unit, and I could drop some clothes off in the lobby for him. So he was hospitalized a total of 26 days in March of 2020, and he came home on April 1st, and he died. He took his own life 48 hours after discharge. And we were in such shock, and all I could keep thinking was, how could somebody be treated in a hospital for almost a month and just 48 hours after they come home die? So I began researching once things settled down a little bit, and found, so I did some research. I sent for his records, which took a long time because you have to go through probate court. So that was an undertaking. But anyhow, what I discovered was the amazing statistic that you just quoted, and that was from the National Alliance for Suicide Prevention, about the high rate right the first week after and the first month after a person comes home from a behavioral health unit. Now, my son Tom was diagnosed with schizophrenia, but this statistic holds for anybody who's in a behavioral health unit. And that includes depression, addiction issues, bipolar, as well as a serious mental illness like schizophrenia and bipolar. So it's a really relevant fact. And the shocking thing is, Tom was hospitalized probably 15 times over the 17 years he was diagnosed with schizophrenia until his death. And we were never told this when he got discharged, because it alters your way of thinking, and the supports you want to be sure are in place, right? If you knew that the very first week that person has a 300 times chance of ending their life. So at any rate, I researched, I wrote this book, in part to tell Tom's story, to honor his life, and also to help the public know what families experience when they help support someone with a serious mental disorder, as well as a cautionary tale I'm hoping that gets out to a lot of healthcare professionals, hospital staff, as well as community mental health support staff, because there's that transition, and that's that gap for when a person leaves the hospital after maybe a suicide attempt or severe depression or whatever it is, the reason they're in the behavioral health unit, and then they come home, and then they have an appointment at their community mental health provider. And that's usually not the very next day. So there's this gap, and that's the critical gap. Who's responsible for that gap? Is it the hospital? Is it the community mental health agency? Well, the SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, the national organization, they've put together guidelines, best practice guidelines. And with a lot, like it's 36 pages, well, I don't know, I'm getting this wrong. It's several pages, maybe 20, but they mention family involvement 36 times, meaning family should be part of that team. And unfortunately in our country, we're not there yet. Families really aren't that big of a team member once a person's hospitalized. And due to HIPAA, which is a good thing, HIPAA is, unless you have HIPAA releases signed everywhere, families are left in the dark. And they need to have that input, because oftentimes a person who's going through a crisis can't think straight. They're either delusional or so upset and anxious, they can't really think clearly. And that's the role of a family member or their support person, to think clearly and give input, and also to help decide how well or unwell that person is and what level of support they need. In the book, I cover many things. One chapter is on communicating with families during hospitalization. Another is screening tools, which I want to talk about in a second.
Please.
Antipsychotic medications and their side effects, because unfortunately that's the treatment that's used. And there are so many drugs, and it's not that drugs are bad. They're very needed, but there's so many side effects, it really becomes a risk-benefit balancing act. Suicide ideation that come with these drugs, right? And this includes not only the antipsychotic group, but antidepressants. Yeah. Many come with that. The other chapters in the book are best practices in care transition, things that I believe should be done, as well as things that I read from the national guidelines. Grief, I have a short chapter on grief because I wanted to speak to what that is like for family members. In my own personal, it's always helpful because it's therapeutic to be able to express yourself, even if, it's just to help you move along. You never really get over losing a person that close to you, but you have to find some way to keep going and maybe feel like their lives made a difference by the things you continue to do. And then at the end of the book, I have resources of everything, all the websites you can go to get these various resources. So some of the ideas that I have from our experience are, as I started out saying, is including family members in the discharge planning and evaluation while the person is in a behavioral health unit prior to discharge. So my only input, and really any of the hospitalization, because I don't want to just target that one hospital, his last hospitalization, it was really no different, any of the hospitals. And Tom was in probably every major hospital in Cleveland, a couple in Summit County, Trumbull County, and at least 3 in North Carolina where he lived with his sister for a couple years. So I visited all of them prior to the COVID. And they're all pretty similar in terms of how they're structured, as well as during the hospitalization, the input they want from the family member. So the main thing that I was ever asked is, do you think he's any better? So when I'm thinking about this after the fact, and in my research, I'm thinking like, there must be scientific rating scales that doctors use and healthcare units and mental health agency use. So I found a lot of different rating scales that are used. One's called the Brief Psychiatric Rating Scale, one's called the Global Assessment, and I refer to all of them. There are many rating scales, and I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, why can't families use something scientific like that? You know, because they know best, like prior to the hospitalization or right afterwards or during even, if they had access to the person. And be able to rate the person how they're doing in various areas: anxiety, delusions, like psychosis versus their reality base. Okay, and then give that scientific input to the healthcare team as part of the team, right? But really, all I was ever asked is, "Do you think he's any better? Do you see any changes?" So. And that's okay, but I have to base it on my brief visit or a brief phone call. Yeah, so that's one area, is to have, okay, I'll tell you one example of, so one phone call, this is 4 days prior to Tom's last hospitalization, right? 4 days before he was discharged. And they had notified me that after the weekend, you know, in like 3 more days, Tom would be discharged. And I said, I don't know, sometimes he's saying some strange things, because first of all, you're not, on most behavioral health units, you don't get to have your own phone, like you would if you were in there to have an appendix removed or diabetes care or whatever, pneumonia. There's a phone on the wall usually in the unit, and they have to go and use it when it's empty at certain times for a certain amount of time, right? So you wait. I worked full time too during most of that. And so I had to be ready to, would the phone ring? So one of the phone calls, 4 days before Tom was discharged, he said to me, do you know how to change an identity? I want to change my name and social security number. When I leave here, I want to get on the bus and go to Oregon and start a new life. I'm afraid the North Koreans are going to capture me and torture me and take me prisoner. Wow. Okay, so that was said to me, and I thought, you're going to come home in 3 days? That's very delusional thinking, right? And it's scary because one of a family's greatest fears when somebody has serious mental illness is that the person will leave. They will have some type of delusional thought and want to leave. And I personally know probably 2 or 3 families whose loved person left and they've never seen them since. One, they got contacted that he was found dead a couple of years afterwards. But I mean, they totally lost contact with their family member. So of course, that was our biggest fear, especially when he said, I want to get on a bus and
Right.
Yeah. So back to this. So that's a very delusional thought. And here it is 4 days before he comes home, right? So of course I tell when they say, how do you think he's doing? I say, I don't think he's at baseline. He just said this to me last night. And they minimize it, or we'll report that. But using one example as a team member to tell so they can rate how he's doing is not enough, and it's not scientific, is my whole point in saying that. I believe that having some type of rating scale, something simple, doesn't have to be complex, you don't have to have a degree of any kind. Families can understand things because they live it. They know when the person is at baseline, they know when the person's delusional or it is a reality. They know better than anybody because sometimes people say wild things that are true, right? Yeah. So families might know. The second Am I going too fast?
You're great.
Okay. So the second area that I think could be improved is notifying families of this startling fact about the high suicide rate. And as I said, we were never notified. I have 4 doctors of psychologist friends, okay? They spent their careers as psychologists, which is very different than working in a behavioral health unit. But they have to deal with the realm of the public. And they're all retired now, but I asked each one of them, did they know the statistic about this high-risk period to be aware of as counselors, and also of families being warned of this? None of them knew it. Not one of those professionals were aware of it. So I thought this is something that really needs to get out more. Now the Suicide Coalition put this out in their articles in 2019, which isn't that long ago. So maybe maybe it just was the timing thing. Maybe that type of study wasn't available at that time. But the point is, I never heard it in my nursing career, although I didn't work on psychiatric units. I worked more in the community health. And we never heard it as a family. So we couldn't put safety plans in place, right? So we know that as far as the community side of it, remember that gap I was talking about? If someone is in the hospital, then they come home, and there's that gap, okay? By law, most states require that that community health agency contacts the person who is discharged within 72 hours. Okay. And I was reassured of that, too. When he left, they said, well, his case manager will be in touch within 72 hours. Well, Tom died 48 hours afterwards. And actually, a mother, after my book was out last year, read my book and contacted me via email and said, I'm a nurse, too. I never knew that. My son died 4 hours after being discharged. He took his life. And so I'm thinking, this is a real need for healthcare workers, not just doctors, but nurses, social workers, community mental health workers, to know this, right? So what was Tom's safety plan when he left the hospital, right? I have a copy of it actually here. All right, you'll see this paper with a green ink on it. So Tom was given a blank form, and I'm not criticizing, again, this was their system. He was given a blank form and a green marker, and they asked him to write down a safety plan so he'd be safe when he went home, right? So it has 5 steps on it. The first step says warning sign. Excuse me, one second, a little dry. The first step says warning signs, and Tom wrote, can't sleep, anxiety, and racing thoughts. All right, so he had that self-awareness that those were his warning signs, that he was unsafe. Step 2 was your internal coping strategies, things I can do to take my mind off my problems. And Tom wrote, listen to music, make art. Now I'll just do a side note here. Oh, you may be able to see, there's a picture of Tom, and then in the front there's one of his acrylic fluid. He really got into fluid acrylic painting. And then the tree is also a smaller picture of he painted, but he loved to paint. He loved to paint, so that's the art he was referring to. Step 3 on the safety plan says people in social settings that provide distraction. Apparently that was an important thing. Keeping safe is providing distraction and being with people. So what did he write in there? There's room for 4 people. He wrote Gail McPeake, which is me, and my phone number. That's it. Step 4, he put people who I can ask for help. He wrote Gail McPeake and my number. That's it. So in his mind, like, I was it, right? That's a huge responsibility, right? Step 5 was professionals or agencies I can contact during a crisis. Blank. Is a blank, right? Yeah. So he didn't write anybody there that he felt he could contact. And then the last one was, last little note here, was making your environment safe. It was blank. Now, one would think, and he signed it, one would think that after a person wrote this, you'd sit down with the person, review it, and kind of fill in the stuff that they didn't, right? And also saying, especially if they were ever suicidal in the past, like, what's your home setting like? You know, do you have a gun at home? I mean, all those types of things. Tom didn't own a gun, but I'm just saying that's what you would think would happen. Now, to their credit, and I'm sure it's a requirement, he was given a printed copy of all the emergency, 911, the suicide coalition line or prevention line. But Tom really thought, he had a fear of the government. He thought the government, one of his delusions was he thought the government planted a chip in his head and that they would someday capture him and bury him alive. Yeah, that's a pretty frightening belief, okay? So is he the type of person who would call a government agency? No. So at any rate, the point of the bringing up the safety plan is this is critical, right? This is a critical thing for not only the person, here's your safety plan, but for the community health worker, all right? So let me talk about the Community Health Agency because they were very caring. They recognized when Tom needed hospitalization to begin with, right? The crisis team had to come and take him there. So I got a call the day that Tom died, actually, that morning. That was day 3, right? Or no, it was day 2, okay? So I had gone home. Let me rewind. So when Tom was discharged, I picked him up. That was April 1st, April Fool's Day. It was April 1st, and I stayed with him for 2 days. I had to get all new medications. He was on 15 different new medications. Some of them were for the side effects, like blood pressure medications and medications for tremoring and this side effect called tardive dyskinesia and different things like that. We had to get food, right? We had to run errands. Then he was living in a house that I owned, which was about an hour away from me, that his sister was going to be living with him eventually. So we did our errands, and I stayed with him that day, and I knew right then he was still quite delusional and sad. But, you know, I was like, you want to eat? You know, I took him to he had this hot dog shop that he loved. We ate there. Mm-hmm. The next day we ordered Chipotle, which he loves. But, so I was watching, and he was pacing and up, right? So I stayed with him another day, made meals, tidied up his place, made sure he had good laundry. And then that evening I went home because I saw that he took a shower by himself, he took his own medications, and I had to go home and sleep. Yeah. Because I was unable to sleep for like 2 nights. And I said, you know, call me if you need me. He had a cell phone. And we'll come back, you know, in a day or two and see how you're doing. So I left, and that next morning I called him at 9:30 in the morning, and he answered the phone, and I said, oh, how you doing? Okay, did you take your medicine? Yeah. And so, okay, and he didn't really feel like talking. So about an hour later, I got a call from the community case management, and they said, we've been trying to make our call. You know, we have to call within 72 hours and see how Tom's doing. But he's not answering. And I said, keep trying to call him, or go over and see him. Send somebody over there, I said, because I didn't want them to make a note saying mother contacted him and said he was fine. I didn't want them to use that as their 72-hour check. So I doubt if they ever got a hold of him because it was only hours later that this happened. So point being, that's such a vulnerable time. And I'm looking back, now that I am aware of this critical time, I probably would have done things a little differently, which is part of the thing I have to live with, right? If I'd have known that first week is so critical when he was, you know, yeah, that maybe I would have made a different plan. But I can't look backward and live my life like that. Instead, I'm looking forward and seeing if I can do anything else to help others, maybe prevent the tragedy. I will want to say, though, I want to talk about the VA a little bit, because they're onto this. You know, the suicide rate for veterans is like 50% higher than the general public, because so many of them deal with PTSD, from the various wars. And they have a program, I don't know how nationwide it is, but many states have this program where they recognize this critical time, and the minute the veteran, if he's hospitalized in their behavioral health unit, they make contact within 24 hours. There's one program where they actually send cards, like care cards. Yeah. Like it's a postcard they have ready for when they're discharged. It's in the mail. So right away the person gets this, like, I care about you, and this is when I'm going to see you, next call here. And just to let them know somebody's out there caring. You didn't just leave the hospital and waiting for your next appointment. So they have a lot, and they actually have a YouTube describing this, their care transition program. So if you ever get a chance, they have a really cool YouTube video. Just look, I should have but it's like YouTube veteran, VA, if you put suicide prevention, care transition, and I'll get that for you too.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So that's pretty cool. All right, so those are my major, one more thing, is to increase the extended care options for people who aren't well enough yet to just be out in the community, right? So this isn't just about schizophrenia, as I said, but as far as people with schizophrenia, a certain percentage, like 25%, really do well on their meds and are able to function in society. Some even have jobs. I have a cousin who was diagnosed in college, and he's 57 now. He's great. Like, he came to a funeral service a few weeks ago, and no one would ever know he had schizophrenia. He was so engaging and asking how people are doing. He wasn't delusional at all, laughing, smiling, interacting. So he's one of that top 25. Then there are another 50% or so who, with enough supports, can manage, right? Can manage. And then there's that other group, 15 to 20%, who have what we call treatment-resistant schizophrenia, where they really benefit if there were some long-term care or extended care, and maybe not long-term care like a nursing home, but extended care, so when they come down from a crisis time, that they could have a little more care. And that would be, and I know was a bill in Congress a couple years ago. I don't know if it's still active or if it died, but where they were trying to do that sort of thing, increase funding for maybe some extended care. Because, back in the day, really in my lifetime, 50 years ago, when they dumped everybody with severe mental illness out into the community, though that care was gone for the serious who needed more supports. And many of those are really actually homeless now. They, up to 50% of people homeless do have serious mental health problems. So at any rate, that would be another thing that I really would like to advocate for. So after I wrote this, how else can I get this message out to people, right? So what I did is sent, at least 50 emails to every head of, in every state there's a head of the SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services, the federal agency for mental health that comes up with these practice guidelines for the communities, right? I sent them all an email introducing the book, and mainly just like, is this part of your best practice? And please include a part of your best practice to let people know about this transition period. A couple responded to me, but I want to give a huge shout out to the one that blew me away. It was Trumbull County. I think her name is April Caraway. She responded right away when she read my email. She said, I'm getting the book. And then 2 weeks later, she responded. She said, this is horrible. Yeah. I'm making sure I get this book for because she runs the mental health board for her county, for my staff, the hospital staff, and the community mental health agency, and require that they read it and then figure out what we can do to make things better. That's wonderful, right? That's the result you hope for, right? So kudos to them, and they invited me to be on their Suicide Coalition group, so I started doing that. And coming to their meetings and talking, just spreading the word. Also, who responded, I also got the mailing list for all. I looked up what colleges teach psychiatrists, have the psychiatry residency program, because it seems like that'd be an important thing to include when you're training people who are going to work in that setting, right? And I got a response actually from Yale, Harvard, I can't remember, Neomed, which is our local one in Rootstown, but and I'll talk about that in a second. But a couple of them said, thank you for this information. We will take a look at it, and if we can, we'll see what we can do with it, which is more than nothing. Yeah. And two of the faculty at Rootstown, Neocom, because they have a psychiatry program, invited me to meet with them at an Akron hospital. Yeah, so kudos to them. And that is at St. Thomas, I think, is the behavioral unit there. And they spent an hour listening to the story here and thinking about how they might include that kind of warning and safety plan for people. Yeah, so I feel good about that. It's really hard to, book sales haven't been that great, and it's really hard when you're not somebody famous or you get on the, I don't know how people get on, but I reached out to like, Oprah's bestseller, you know, all those, never heard anything back from those kind of things. And then news agencies, right? And someone from the Washington Post said, I'll be in contact maybe when we do a thing. So far, you, Voices for Voices, have been one of the most responsive media type of outlets. So I do appreciate this opportunity.
You're welcome.
So my journey as a mom, if you want me to cover that maybe, on a personal note, it's something you never think twice of when your child has an illness, right? You're there. You don't, it doesn't matter whether they're a child or have become an adult. Most often, once people are adults, it becomes tricky because they're their own guardian, right? So they can do what they want. Other professionals have to only talk to them. If they're in the hospital, they can't let you know they're in the hospital unless the person has enough wherewithal to say, I want this person to know that I'm here, right? So there were a few times Tom was in the hospital and I didn't even realize it until, you know, maybe I'd get a call saying, do you know your son is here? But it's tricky in the times when he's not in the hospital or wasn't in the hospital, is that all those years, right? The contact. Now, Tom was a very loving, friendly, good son. That's all I can say. He wasn't, like he'd call me every day. He'd call me every day and sometimes several times a day. And he might just say, hi, just what do you do? How's it going? And he wouldn't listen to me very long because he'd want to talk a little bit. And then he'd hang up. But he'd always say, thanks for everything you do for me, Mom. So he was such a grateful guy, right? And I really miss, I miss those phone calls. But I always had to think about his medications, check on him, was he really taking them, and follow up with everything. Make sure I used to have to take him to his psychiatry appointments. And do things like, if I wanted to tell the psychiatrist something, I couldn't just say it because Tom would like, don't talk about me, So I would have to write little notes and try to get to them before the appointment, which they could use or not use the information. I was trying to be a team member, and that was the only way I could be a team member. So for instance, back in 2014, I wrote one psychiatrist before our visit, just to give you a flavor of the support that's needed, right? That the person, once they're there or if they're having a very delusional day, might not be able to tell the doctor. So I wrote this note ahead of time saying, it's been about 4 weeks since Tom saw you and increased his risperidol. We're still seriously concerned for his failure to get back to an acceptable point of stability. Tom's paranoia, delusions, and hallucinations continue to consume him. He can't even act meaningfully with his son. Unless we coached him. His son Simon was visiting us. He didn't live with them. He lived with his mom, Simon did. Simon, and we would have him over occasionally because they didn't live in the same city. But Tom and his 14-year-old son Simon were at our home for 3 days, and Tom couldn't focus enough to interact with Simon. So we'd say, why don't you go sit with Simon? Why don't you watch TV? This is the things I was telling the doctor. His apartment is a filthy, disorganized mess with dirty dishes, trash, and cigarette butts covering the floor of every room. I took 14 loads of laundry home to wash, which he had not done in a month. Tom laughed about it, saying he wore dirty clothes to work last weekend, 3 days in a row. Well, he worked in a bloody meat market in the area where you sanitize everything. So you don't want to be wearing dirty clothes to that, right? And I'm sure the grocery store will not continue his employment in this condition. Tom claims he's taking his medications, but we're not seeing enough results. Even his sisters admit to being afraid at times because he's talking so erratic. Can you think of how to get him to take an Invega injection again? What else can be done? So here I am making suggestions because I know what worked in the past, right? Mm-hmm. And I know that he must not be getting the right level of medication, or he must not be maybe he's skipping them. The doctor wouldn't know that unless I tell him. Tom's sure not going to tell him, right? So that's that important piece of family or team input, family as a team member. And, he saw a psychiatrist every 3 months. So imagine that over 17 years, every 3 months, you worry, you contact. And I found myself not only acting as his advocate, but often as his case manager and his support system. And one would think that having me as a nurse, right, for a mother, I would have like an in or a leg up, like an advantage, right, in the healthcare system. But it really didn't make a difference. A, because of the HIPAA requirements. B, I'm not a psychiatric nurse, although I feel like I've learned a lot through the years, right? And I've cared for other people in the community with serious mental health issues. But it is a little different when it's your person and you have to be there day to day advocating him. The one advantage I did have is that Tom willingly signed the HIPAA agreement. He wasn't the type of person like, get out of here, you can't come with me. So luckily, I did have more information than, maybe I was able to have enough information. So the other part of a chapter in the book that I want to talk about, and just the subject itself, is grief. Yeah. So one would think that, let me first go talk a little about my nursing career. Early in my nursing career, when I've been a nurse 50 years, okay? All right, so early on, I was an OR nurse for a few years, a hospital nurse, a doctor's office nurse, a school nurse. But my main decades of career were in the field of developmental disabilities, taking care of or overseeing the care of people in the community in group homes or in apartments that had developmental disabilities. And they had lots of different diagnoses and all. But the first place I ever worked for was an agency that took care of children, seriously disabled children. And it was, I guess you'd call it an institution now. There were 124 children that lived there from age 2 to 21. And none of them could speak, all in wheelchairs, all had to be full-time care for all of their needs, right? Feeding, hygiene, everything. So they were, for different reasons, they were there. Accidents, birth defects, kids who didn't get vaccinations and then got had terrible brain damage at times from certain viruses. But about 10 of those children died every year, okay? And I was there for 17 years, so I knew a lot of the families. I knew the kids, overseeing their care for that long a period of time. And so I knew them when they died, right? So think about that, over 17 years, an average of maybe 10 children dying a year. That's almost 200 kids, right? It was very different to have my own child die, even though I was close to those children. So you would think that whether they have developmental disabilities or a serious mental illness, you really kind of lose that child at that point, right? If they're born normal, like most people with serious mental illness, and then they get sick at age 22, 23, they become a different person. They become a different person, and so there's a period where you kind of mourn that loss. Oh, I guess they'll never maybe graduate from college, which is not to say some don't, but they'll need a level of support. Jobs, driving, all of those things become either non-existent or minimal, right? So there's grief there, and then if they happen to die before you, there's grief there, and it's you miss them. Even though it was a struggle, and you knew how much they struggled, it's a huge loss. It's a huge cavity. So I wanted to read what my daughter wrote, because I do have to mention Tom has 2 sisters, and they were highly impacted as well. It wasn't just me, the mother, right? Mm-hmm. Highly impacted. They were wonderful support to their brother. His sister Julie, she had him over all the time, and she would check when he lived in an apartment alone. She'd go there and clean his apartment, and take him out to eat. Bonnie lived in North Carolina during Tom's kind of his last years. And when he had a crisis where he thought World War III was happening and had to leave Ohio, he agreed to go live with her. So she took him in, and that was a wonderful thing. And she provided a lot of happiness for him, and stability, and a feeling of safety for him. But she helped me with this book, doing the graphics and all, and editing. And she wrote a paragraph that I got her permission to use in here about grief, if I could read it.
Yes, please.
Oh, I didn't mention, because she speaks of this, that their dad had schizophrenia as well. Oh. Okay? So my first marriage, Tom's father, although most people get schizophrenia when they're in their early 20s or late teens, he didn't get it until he's almost 30. Yeah, and we had been married a few years by then. So the kids were already born, all right, and then he got it, and we did end up getting divorced. But it was still, even though my kids didn't live with their dad then, after, since they were little kids, they still had 15 years or so, because he died young as well. They had 15 years where he was in their lives and they worried about him. That's their dad, regardless whether he had severe mental illness, all right? So she references that. So this is my daughter, Bonnie, what she wrote in the about grief. My heart was broken by this disease that took my daddy away when I was a little girl and replaced him with this zombie-like person. Just a body, really, that used to contain my dad until I was in my early 20s. I was devastated when he died, but also a bit relieved not to have to be needled all day by this disease that ruined my father's life. I thought maybe I could go on and heal. Then shortly after he died, my little brother started to suffer from the same fate. I'd been through crushing stress of mental illness for my whole life already, and now I knew it wasn't going to go away. Now my brother would turn into a zombie like my dad. It was traumatic for me to be around him and see what ruined my childhood and broke my heart. It was so sad for me to hopelessly watch my little brother lose his life in the way that my father did. So when she's talking about zombie, a lot of the medications, maybe we can talk a little about that. Medications tend to sometimes change a person too, by their side effects, right? So many of those antipsychotics, and not so much the antidepressants, but they have their own side effect profile, have some really serious side effects, like sedation for number one, like making people want to sleep. And I have a sibling actually who was put on Depakote, for example, which is started out as a seizure med, but it's used like first. It's almost like the most popular medication for bipolar now. Because it's a mood stabilizer, right? But it causes extreme sedation, especially when you first start on it. My relative was started on it, and she actually fell asleep behind the wheel and got a DUI. Yeah, so it's considered whether you're drinking alcohol or taking a medication, there's one of the risks, right? Safety. Luckily, she didn't get into a horrible accident. So side effects. So side effects of sedation, blood pressure changes. Tom was on 2 different blood pressure medications that they quadrupled when he was in his final hospital because his blood pressure got so high from the meds that were supposed to try to help him. There's a side effect called tardive dyskinesia, which means late abnormal muscle movements. That's very common in people taking antipsychotics. Even whether it's the older ones like Haldol, Mellaril, Thorazine, or the newer second-class generation ones like Zyprexa, Risperdal, Seroquel. There's newer ones too, Latuda. There's about 15 now. But they all have that potential for tardive dyskinesia. And suicide ideation is also on pretty much every one except Clozaril. Suicide ideation is listed. And many of the antidepressants, as you probably know from talking to people, also have that caveat in the or black box warning that it could cause suicide ideation. Now, that's the one thing that mystifies me still, that concept. I tried looking up, like, what does that mean? And I know it means, like, having thoughts of ending your life, right? That's what suicide ideation means. But it's always boggled my mind. How could a medication that's supposed to help you feel less depressed, less anxious, less psychotic, how could that make you feel like you want to end your life? So I still don't have a clear answer from researching that, I did find one study that said something about the side effects, or maybe it causes clarity and then the person realizes different things. I don't know. I don't know if I'm at, can I ask you? Like, do you have any concept or experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, myself being on antidepressants, and you mentioned Seroquel, that's one. And yeah, I personally, I don't get how something that's supposed to help puts you right, maybe in the cusp of thinking about ending your life, which is one of the very things it's supposed to take you away from. And personally, from having the side effects of drowsiness, and some of them take a little bit of time to even start working. And so that was always a concern of mine of, okay, well, I don't feel great. Well, the doctor would say, well, it's going to take a couple weeks. It's like, but I don't know how I'm going to make it a couple of weeks to get to that point. Luckily, I just had the medication change, and it was another antidepressant added in a smaller dose. And yeah, just the depression part, for me, it's helping, but there still are times where I don't feel great, and these like just random thoughts come in. It's not even, oh, I'm gonna take a rope and it's not like those types of things. It's just more like, okay, well, maybe what I'm doing isn't making an impact, and that can happen to anybody, whether they have a mental illness or not. And so those types of things do creep in, and getting that validation, and you mentioned with the VA having the postcard ready when somebody is discharged, those types of things, it is incredible. Those little types of things when I get in the mail, or if it's a text message or an email, just the different ways of, even it's just like, hey, thanks. It doesn't have to be some paragraphs and some news story, but just getting those is this nice validation. And from an early age, I remember I had, and part of it, my sister, she had straight A's, and I was like the perfect person and per se, and then I came along and my grades were not as great, and she had job offers right out of school, like 4 or 5, and I struggled. And so it was just constant trying to prove myself of like, look at what I'm doing, look at it, because I'm not a failure. And even though I wasn't, those thoughts were happening at an early age. And even now, I'm 41, and I'm feeling like, when there's an episode going, like, hey, look, we just taped it. 'Cause I want people to know that we're doing good work, and what I'm doing matters. And even, at my phase of finding out at age 35, with the major depression and anxiety and low spectrum autism, and these things that I'd been told, well, you can't have that because you should have been diagnosed when you were younger. You can't have that. And so those types of things would creep in too. Like, people were questioning me, like I'm trying to be open about, here's me. And so when I speak and talk, like, okay, I have some experience around it. And when people question it, it's like, oh my gosh, like all I'm trying to do is help. I'm not saying I'm an expert. I don't have the training. You're a nurse, you have that training, and you're done a ton of research into the field. And so those little things, they come up, they creep up from time to time. And even now, it's like, oh my gosh, like, am I doing stuff that matters? And like, is it really gonna matter if I'm still around in 10 years? And where it's not, I'm not making the plans to end it. But then find out when I was admitted that those are suicide ideation type of things, pulling away from things. And so now to your point about the clarity, there are times where the clearness of what's happened, what's going on, where I am clear. I'm like, oh my gosh, like I go from having, I'll say negative thoughts to like, okay, I have things in good shape. And so that mental energy is opened up. And I've heard and read different stories where some people to take their own lives, it's when they're busy, it's good to be busy, because if they're not, then it has a moment of clarity or just to think and slow down. And they're just like, okay, you've done a lot of good, great things. And it's not that they had like thought about it, like, oh, maybe they thought about it for weeks and weeks and weeks. And it could just be that moment in time where they had a moment to think and like, oh my gosh, like, okay, what's the big deal? And then it happens. And I'm clearly trying to stay away from that and trying to just pack my life with things. And it might, especially my wife, come across as very busy and time consuming, but for me, I most have to do it. I need to be consumed by something, and those times of meditation and trying to slow the mind down, well, I do need that, and time for sleep. Times throughout the day, I just need to have things on my schedule. And I even asked my therapist a couple years ago, because I was worried about that. I was like, am I ever gonna, I feel like once I accomplish these 3 things or email these 3 people, then what am I going to do? And he said, Justin, you're always going to have things that you're doing. And so I've kind of just taken that, and when I have my list of things to do, like, okay, well, I need to do this, I'm going to do that. And anyways, that's just a little bit of like my feedback.
And I'm loving, I'm noting some of the things you were saying just now. So it's not just about medications, right? It's all those other tools that you're doing, right? And so maybe that's a piece of this message, right? It's not as this message that's trying to support a person. So just one other thing I want to say about suicide ideation. So if these meds all say that, right, and we need them so badly, certain people really need them. And they're not happy pills. They are help you get through each day or think more clearly, right? Then what kind of support do you need? Like, somebody has to be monitoring that, right? You can't be in this world alone. So you reach out. You have other tools, like you mentioned, meditation. You have your therapist person to talk to. You do self-gratification. Like I'm sure you have your, okay, these are the things I'm going to do. And then you reflect on them, too. Like, okay, no, these are the things I've accomplished. And some people even write them out, right? Like affirmations, they call them. But that's why other people are so important to, to not avoid people who are depressed, even though they don't want to join you, but just to say a little something, or, reach out a little bit. That a text even can make a difference to some people, because that's the thing we use now, right? And to be really careful about our words, our posts on Facebook that could come across as like so judgmental, and, because we're divided about our politics, maybe, but that doesn't mean we can't love each other.
Absolutely.
I had to come to that conclusion, because even in our own families, But it's all those things of remembering, like, we're just vulnerable humans. Humans are so sensitive, I think. Yes, we're, amazing and strong compared to the animal world or the rest of the world, animal world, but we're not. We're delicate, sensitive, and we need each other, and we need those tools, right? So if we're taking a medication that might have these side effects, you need somebody to help monitor that, right? And then having a safety plan as such of what I can do. Okay, here are my affirmations. Maybe I'll go sit in a hot bathtub or whatever it is, or this type of we know a type of music, most of us know, that help change our mood, right? I don't know about you, but I have playlists to perk me up. So just all of those things. It's so important that we're there for each other in big or small ways, right? Yeah. So I want to thank you for the opportunity. I'm not sure if I covered everything.
Is there anything that you can think of? We have a couple minutes left. If there's something you want to talk about.
Just encouraging, maybe there's so many people going into the nursing field now, because it's a field that, first of all, baby boomers like myself, by the day, there's 10,000 of us reaching age 65. And that'll happen for a decade or so more. And we're going to need nursing care, right? And there's already a nursing shortage. I have 2 nieces that are graduating, actually, this year from nursing school. And so many nurses, too, want to go on right away now and be nurse practitioners, which is fine. We need those, too. But we also need a lot of, and you might think, well, I'm going into obstetrics. I'm going into surgery. But you need this information. Right? Yeah. Because you will run across people who are depressed in obstetrics, who are depressed in or having struggles, addiction struggles. We all know that what a big thing that is. So nursing students need to know this. I have two little personal comments. One is about the tools and support. Last week I attended a funeral for a 17-year-old. And this was, a kid who had a lot of friends, was a great student, a great personality, but who knows what tips people, right? And it was so sad and so sudden, like young people, because I know this with my own family members, when something happens, because I remember being young once, something happens like a boyfriend breakup or whatever, it's the end of the world, right? And you think no one will ever care about you. So somehow they need that big picture. And maybe they be reminded. I think that's why we're supposed to take history classes, to look back at history and say, like, look what we went through 50 years ago. My generation, oh my gosh, nuclear war threat, hiding under the desks, assassinations. And now things happen in young people, but it might seem like really huge to them. So adults, right, experienced adults need to present the big picture, I think. And reassure, and not have the doom and gloom and of watching the news every day and just pointing out the bad, because that can suck people down. The other thing is, I came across a great article, maybe someone sent it a few weeks ago or months ago, that talked about when you have a friend or a loved one with depression, try not to just be there. Just be there for them, or listen to them, or hang out in the same room. Try not to let's have a positive attitude. Yeah. Look at this person, or let's try this. So if you just try to, preaching to a person or trying to think you're helpful by saying, oh, look at the bright side. They can't hear that. Yeah, and it's actually like an insult to a person really in the depths of depression. So that was one thing I wanted to mention about that. And there was another, but I'm a senior, I forgot it. The nursing students, yeah. I have another friend's daughter who's out west, and she is a new nurse as of a few months ago. And she wanted to work in psychiatric. So she just got her first job in an actual behavioral health unit in a hospital. Okay. And so I'm real curious to know, how things run there, So I'm hearing some stories, but I want to find out what their kind of safety plans are, and there's a little in. So maybe promote that. Send her a book. Yeah. So thanks again.
You're welcome.
Do you have anything else that?
No, you covered everything that I was hoping to cover and more. We just want to thank you for your time and continuing in Tom's legacy and sharing him with our organization, sharing with the world.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you reaching out. So
happy to include you with what's going on, because it's important, and to your point, doesn't matter what field you're in, mental health is health. So just because we can't see it, there are things that people are going through regardless of whether they have been diagnosed with depression today. They might be going through depressive times.
Exactly. A trauma might have happened, and then they're like, whoop.
And I know for myself, you just hit the nail on the head. Just being there for somebody, with my family sometimes, that's what, just having somebody in the same room. Not that you have to have a conversation the whole time, but just kind of being there and knowing that somebody cares and is sitting there, and that's 100% correct from somebody who feels that way, and I've and continue trying to do better. But just thank you for everything you do, and just more success of being able to share and advocate and getting the message across, so people are educated about the numbers, the experience, what you've gone through, and being a nurse and having, even if it wasn't in the psychiatric field, there's still things that are common, like you mentioned, like blood pressure and blood sugar that really affect everybody. That we gotta check. Thank you, and
Thanks.
thank you to our audience, our viewers, our listeners for joining in this episode of the Voices for Voices podcast. And a big thank you to our in-studio guest today, Gail McPeake, for spending some time with us. And until next time, I am Justin Allen Hayes, and I hope you have a great day and be a voice for you or somebody in need.